You're listening to the Veterinary Cannabis Society podcast. This podcast is part of our mission to educate the world on the science of veterinary cannabis. Today, we're interviewing Hanna Mandelbaum, the co-founder of Evermore Pet Food. Evermore offers some of the highest grade, sustainably sourced, ethically cultivated, gently cooked pet food, including their newly released cat food line. Evermore is the longest running and highest sponsor of the Veterinary Cannabis Society. As you'll hear in this podcast, Hanna is unequivocally dedicated to animal welfare and the scientific process. There's so much to learn from her about the meat industry, animal nutrition, and even your own food choices. We offer this podcast with a trigger warning. Some sensitive topics will be discussed. You'll be warned at that time if you want to skip ahead. And now, to the podcast. Hanna, thank you so much for joining me today. Let's just dive right into it. Can you tell me a little bit more about your background before Evermore and then how you came to form Evermore Pet Food?
Sure. So prior to Evermore, I was living in New York City in Brooklyn, and I was working as a dog walker, but that was mostly to support myself as a visual artist and also my budding career as a trapeze artist. So that was my pre-Evermore days, and that all came to a very sudden end when the company began. The founders are myself and my business partner, Allison, at the time, and the time is sort of the late 2000s. Allison was a dog walking client of mine and a health supportive personal chef. So she was trained in how to create functional food recipes for healing purposes and holistic support of human beings. And that sounds like a story, right? A dog walker and a chef get together and start a company. But that's actually not the story. The real story started years prior. After 9/11, I had another dog walking client, and she had lived in Tribeca during that time period. And after the towers came down and the neighborhood was filled with rubble, a few months later, her dog developed cancer. She believed that all of the toxins from the neighborhood caused the cancer in her dog, and was given a 6-month prognosis for him. She researched everything. Like all of us, she loved her dog so much and wanted to help extend his life. After a lot of research, she landed on food and home cooking, a healthy, health supportive diet, and also herbal medicine. Working with a holistic vet in Vermont, she developed a recipe, and her dog lived for another 6 years. During that time period, she sort of became the neighborhood dog chef. And she took that a little further. She had somewhat scaled it. She had a couple stores in New York City, and she actually got a write-up in the New York Times. But she didn't have the best business sense. It didn't really go anywhere. And in the meantime, she got priced out of the neighborhood and moved to my neighborhood in Brooklyn. Somehow I ended up becoming her dog walker when she developed pneumonia. And I learned about the company over time. She ended up getting better from the pneumonia, but kept me on as her dog walker, I think just because she liked the company. One day in the morning when I was supposed to be going over there, I get a phone call from her. Her voice is slurring, and she tells me she thinks she's in the middle of having a stroke. And I'm like, did you call 911? No, she called me first, her dog walker. So I rushed over there, got kind of swept up in the situation. She didn't really have any family or close friends. She was a bit one of those eccentric loner types. So somehow I ended up in this swirl of helping to take care of her, manage her life, being sort of the caretaker figure. And at first it was supposed to be a short-term situation. It was a minor stroke. She was supposed to be up on her feet and back in around 2 months. In the meantime, Allison was kind of trying to figure out her life. Her apartment building had been sold. She was sort of thinking maybe she'd move back to California. And she, through a mutual friend, was connected to me in this capacity. And it was sort of hey, maybe you can sublet this woman's apartment, help with some of the custom dog food recipes, and figure out your life, and everyone can be on their merry way when Mia, that was her name, gets better. That's not what happened. Within a few weeks, Mia ended up having another stroke. And she was basically, she didn't leave a hospital or rehab facility for the rest of her life. She was rendered pretty much completely paralyzed. She couldn't speak or swallow. Allison and I, of course, stepped in. We're still working with this food, trying to figure out how to help this woman. And nobody knows how much she was going to recover. So all of her customers from Tribeca were basically like, this is totally tragic. Can we still get our dog food? Allison's own dog, Hunter, who had never had a bad meal in his life. He ate raw food, he ate home cook. He started thriving on this particular food. So we came to the decision, this food needs to be in this world. And with Mia's blessing, we restarted the company, sort of not really functioning as an actual business. So we restarted the company, and here we are 15 years later.
I'm not crying. You're crying. I'm not crying.
It's a pretty intense story. It took me a while to, like, on a personal level, really come to terms with how it happened. But I think in the end, Mia really would have wanted to see us carry it on like this. And I think she'd be really happy that we've taken it to the place that we have.
Was it always called Evermore though?
The original company, and this is actually the first time I'm telling this publicly, the original company was called Righteous Dog Food, and the branding was an Afghan hound. She had an Afghan hound with a Che Guevara cap on its head.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So
Righteous.
yeah, it's righteous, exactly. The righteous cause. But when we started over, I'd love to say that we fully came up with a name, but originally there were a couple of people in the neighborhood helping out, and one of the dogs was named Ever. And it just had a really nice sound to it, Evermore, and it sounded like it connected where it began and where it was going. So that's really the background of the name.
Yeah. Mia might not be there anymore, but her food recipes will live on forevermore.
Basically, although to be perfectly honest, they weren't the most balanced, so we did have to make some tweaks.
Okay, well, that's
Yeah.
the perfect segue into telling me more about what makes Evermore pet food so special.
So we, in starting this, first of all, we were one of the first few companies out there to make a gently cooked, what is now referred to as human grade pet food. There were a few, different places in the country. Most of them aren't around anymore, but really we were very early adopters for this. The idea is a home cooked recipe, but commercially scaled. And what differentiates us and the way we did it is we love all animals, and not just the animals that we're feeding, but the animals whose lives are sacrificed to make our food. So from day one, we made animal welfare our number one sourcing priority. And another thing that is a major priority for us is the quality, right? So our produce is certified organic. Now, these are things that we move towards. Originally, I'd say our sourcing was always good, but I'd say where we are now is way better than when we started. And we're constantly trying to continue to raise our own bar, because no matter how good you're doing, there's always a step further that you can take it.
So tell me a little bit about, like, literally, I know from your website, it started just as dog food. And now you potentially are moving into cat food. But tell me a little bit more about what the different kinds of dog food you have. I think you have beef, correct? Like, tell me a little bit more about those.
Yeah, sure. So we currently offer 4 proteins. We have beef, we have chicken, we have turkey, we have lamb, and that's for the dog. And we just launched cat, and we're super excited about it. It's been at least 5 years in the making. I cannot tell you how much. I think there's 8 different iterations of the formula. And, with cats, you really have to get it right. They are super picky creatures. we have some really picky dogs in our customer base, but the norm for dogs is that they'll eat a wide range of things. They'll pretty much eat anything. Obviously, there's many exceptions to that rule, but with cats, they're so finicky, so discerning. So it was really important to us to make our main goal was to make something fresh that they would eat. And that's and we do have treats coming out. I'm very excited about that as well.
Oh, okay. So you mentioned when you first introduced the idea of what actually goes into making your food, you mentioned that from the very beginning, you've been trying to source sustainable protein sources, organic vegetable sources. Can you tell me a little bit? Because I've seen, you and I have spoken about, and I've also seen on your website, there's a term regenerative ingredients and there's the term sustainable. What's the difference between those terms?
Sure, I think they both have the sustainable, I'd say, has more of the ability to be a bit of a catch-all. It's kind of hard because all of these things are turning into buzzwords. But with sustainable, I would say it's things that are raised in a way that is most conscious of reducing negative impacts, right? So avoiding the use of antibiotics, that would be sustainable, or even the way people are treated on farms, that would be sustainable. Using organic pesticides, that would be sustainable. So these are things designed to reduce harm, I would say. And then the idea of regenerative is creating a positive effect, regenerating, right? Bringing the land and the soil back to where they used to be before, I hate to say it, we totally screwed the planet. A good example of this, and I think where you see it the most, is in ranching. And we know that cattle are a huge driver of climate change, and for so many reasons, right? They're grazing out the land and just destroying whole fields, and they produce methane gas, and forests are cut down for their feed, right? There's like so many reasons why cattle are bad. But with regenerative ranching, it's looking at how can we mimic natural patterns? Because if you think about it, there were large herds of wild herbivores long before we got here. There were millions of bison roaming across the plains, and we pretty much killed them all. And then changed the ecosystem by introducing different animals, but treating them very differently behaviorally, right? Cows, the way we usually raise them, they're in discrete areas where they graze. They don't really necessarily move. They have their feedlots where they're eating corn and soy. They're very different in terms of their behaviors and the way that they live than the wild roaming herbivores that preceded them. Now, when we look at regenerative ranching, it's more about mimicking these natural patterns and these natural cycles to regenerate. I'm going to keep having to use the word regenerate to describe regenerative, but to bring balance back to the soil and to really sort of honor these natural cycles. And so much of it has to do with soil, and so much of what has to do with soil is plants. And step one of maintaining the health of plants, right, is not letting the cows stand in the same spot all the time, and really being conscious of rotating them around to different fields so that plants have the ability to grow back. And depending on the environment that this is in, context can be everything. Sometimes it's natural native species, sometimes things need to be planted, forage needs to be planted, and hopefully with the end result of more native plants can be introduced. But even in moving and in grazing, cattle serve a role. When they are pooping, they reintroduce healthy bacteria to the soil. Trampling is actually a good thing too, because the soil being packed helps maintain the gases, the carbon that goes into the soil as part of the photosynthetic process. Sorry, that was a lot.
No, it's great. I'm sitting here, I'm like hanging on your every word. It's so interesting. It's causing me to think so many more questions. But I think as I'm smiling, asking you this, did you ever expect to learn so much about farming, agriculture, and plants when you started or picked up a pet food company?
No, absolutely not. And I'm just going to even say I am a total layperson, right? I'm not a rancher. I'm not like a climate or soil scientist. So my understanding even is very rudimentary. These systems, right? These natural systems that we have, carbon cycles, methane cycles, like that's all incredibly complicated stuff. So I'd say that my understanding is scratching the surface, and I learn something new all the time.
Hmm. So I kind of have another question kicking around in my head, and I think this is, part of Allison's previous world is there's this big discussion as to whether organic or grass-fed or free-range proteins, and dairy products from those kinds of proteins taste better. And I think there's people who say, oh, that's just hoity-toity. It doesn't actually taste better. It just tastes better in their brains because it costed more. And then there's other people who say, no, 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 no. The flavor is completely different. The taste is much better. And that they can, generally tell the difference outside of the price point. When we're talking about pet food, it's interesting to me because we know our pets like something because they eat a lot of it. And you had, some examples that you told earlier about people's dogs being picky and just thriving on this pet food. But what is like the driver outside taste or, even an animal's morals to put these ingredients into your food? Does it taste better, in your humble opinion? And why do you think animals know the difference? Or do
You
they?
know, I don't think animals know the difference so much in whether or not it tastes better. Their taste buds are very different and in a lot of ways simpler than ours. So I don't even know that taste is not the driving force for the quality of the ingredients. Although I have to say, me as a human, I can definitely taste the difference. And I 100% prefer grass-fed meat, but some people don't because it is slightly gamier. But back to in terms of what it brings to the table or the bowl, for our pets is nutritional difference. So the taste might not be too much different from them in terms of a commodity beef or a grass-fed beef, but in terms of what that grass-fed beef is packing, it's a whole different ball of wax. I mean, you're going to find that grass-fed beef has a much better omega ratio, right? Omega 3s. We know that they are good for you. And there are so much more of them in grass-fed beef than in conventional. We look at pastured eggs, which we use. There's also that same thing, the omegas. We also know that they're higher in critical vitamins and minerals. One of the things that we really focus on in our food is minimal targeted supplementation. So we really believe that animals should be getting their vitamins, minerals, everything that they need from the food itself, and not just from like a sprinkled on premix. Now, there are places where, and actually not many places, but there are a couple of nutrients that we need to add, actually more in our cat food. But one thing that we noticed when we had to switch, or not had to, made the switch that we completely wanted from certified humane free range eggs to fully pastured eggs. At the time, we had been supplementing with choline in our poultry formulas, but when we retested it after making the switch, our levels on their own were good enough that we could get rid of that extra supplement. That is how different they are. And the same with switching from really good quality, it was grass-fed, grain-finished beef. It was actually Nyman Ranch, which was it is still like a really, really highly regarded company. But at the time, they didn't have 100% grass-fed. When we moved over and did that testing, we saw that our omega ratios changed. And that's actually really cool. That's something you read about, you Google it, and you'll see something written as, just a statistic, but there's something really beautiful about getting to see it for yourself.
Yeah. No, I wonder how much did you think about this related to your own diet? before you started diving into the Evermore recipe making process?
Oh my God. So when I first moved to Brooklyn, I have to say, it was after college. I didn't have very much money, and I would categorize myself as a bodegatarian, right? So my egg and cheese sandwiches from the corner store, like ice cream. I cannot even tell you how many ice cream sandwiches I ate. I mean, I knew
Oh my
how to be healthy, and I was vegetarian, but it was sort of one of our taglines is like, we believe our pets should eat the way we should eat, with the should being kind of the key factor there. And I do have to say, once I started the company, and I'm completely different from Allison. Allison was like totally healthy. But once we started the company, I shifted my eating patterns a bit to be more healthy.
Okay, so I want to go back to a term that you mentioned earlier. You mentioned animal welfare. And just based on what we've already talked about, I can assume that means that animals are given enough space to roam and to pasture. But what else does animal welfare mean?
Sure. I mean, animal welfare is about creating an environment where farmed animals can express as much of their natural behaviors as possible. There's several components to this, right? You mentioned having enough room to roam, and even with that, in larger farming systems, there are still going to be large indoor barns. So if we're talking about poultry, then they're given extra environmental enrichment. They are on natural light cycles. Then there is diet. Diet is a big part of welfare. There's avoiding antibiotics, and in the case of ruminants, hormones. These interventions can actually create very uncomfortable situations for the animals. We don't really think about it, but how do you feel when you're on antibiotics?
Not great.
How did you feel when you were growing and hit growth spurts?
That was painful. And my cats are going through it now. I can see it.
Yeah, and that's painful for the animals too, and it's not something we think about. And it's minimizing physical interventions, right? And people don't think about this, but chickens are often debeaked, cattle are branded. So there's all of these ways in which we mutilate farmed animals for convenience in handling and raising them. There's also handling. It can be very stressful for animals to be handled, so it's about minimizing handling. And then the final piece of this puzzle is the slaughter process. And there are more and less humane ways to do this, which we could get into in excruciating detail with poultry if you want.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, it's hard for me to say I don't want that, to be honest with you. But I mean, I know we can go down a rabbit hole and I'll pull us out soon-ish, but can I ask you to clarify, chickens are debeaked? How
Oh
does
yeah. I just made a gesture, but yeah, they can take off a chicken's beak, and part of the reason is chickens are kind of aggressive animals. I don't think people think about chickens like this, but they're basically one of the closest living relatives to T-Rex. Like when you look at chickens, you can see how they're descended from dinosaurs, and they can be very territorial. They have their own hierarchies. They fight each other, and the rationale for debeaking is really to keep them from tearing each other apart because they have them in such close quarters. So,
Wow. Oh my
yeah.
gosh. Okay, so I would like to ask a little bit, uh, you know, I have this interest. I'll just tell you a little bit about me. I am also a fitness instructor. So I, of course, loved your trapeze section of your story. But one of the interesting reasons why many people who study fascial anatomy are also vegetarians is because there's a term that's used frequently now in common, popular media is the body keeps the score. And so if you believe that the body holds the trauma, most notably in your fascial structures, which we share with the animals that we eat, then feasibly that score is kept inside of us when we pass away. So if an animal has a traumatic death, somehow that trauma will be kept in its body even when it's processed for food. That's a very, metaphysical kind of conversation and philosophical kind of conversation to have. But I wonder if that's some of the underpinnings of this idea.
Well, actually, I can't believe I said well, actually. But traumatized animals do, again, I'm not a total scientist here, but they do release hormones when they're under stress. And we know that it does affect the flavor of the meat. So wherever you want to be with this metaphysically, there is absolutely grounding in this.
Wow, that's so interesting. So, how are animals made into food in a nice way?
Hmm. That's a little loaded. Do you mean what would be the nicest version of this?
Yeah, like these chickens.
Okay, and chickens have it. I just want to crow about this really quickly. We recently won the Compassion in World Farming Good Chicken Award, so I just have to get that out there. And I definitely know way too much about chicken. But the more humane way to slaughter a chicken is something called controlled atmosphere stunning. So in this method of slaughter, chicken in kind of their crates, they don't have to aggressively handle them, are basically put through a tunnel where they are exposed to increasing levels of a gas, either carbon dioxide or nitrogen, which renders them irreversibly unconscious before going through what would be called a slaughter line, which is a very mechanized process. And in traditional slaughter, which I really do think I need to contrast it, and I'm really sorry.
Hi, it's the Veterinary Cannabis Society editors here. This podcast is about to go into a discussion about the animal slaughter process, and it's kind of intense. If that's not something you want to listen to, skip ahead 1 minute.
So
Right.
the most common method of slaughter is called live shackle slaughter. And basically, flapping traumatized birds are hung upside down in shackles and they are run over on a conveyor belt in electrified bath, which is basically to stun them and it's not irreversible. Then they are go to the part where their heads get cut off, making a gesture here, where their heads get cut off, and then they are run through a boiling water bath to loosen their feathers. Now, the horror of this, I mean, it's all horrific, the entire process, but a flapping bird can potentially avoid the electrocution bath. It can also, depending on how much it's struggling, avoid that blade, which leaves it to be boiled alive.
Oh
So
no.
not particularly humane.
Yeah.
And that's what the slaughter process is being, that's the comparison there.
Okay. So one of the things that's kind of been on my mind during this process is I think what is on a lot of people's minds when they hear the word organic or bio, if you will, price points. And it sounds to me like if an organization wants to practice regenerative protein sourcing or giving, sorry, I don't know like the right terms to use, or if they want to be sustainable, or if they want to really have great animal welfare, sounds like they're going to need to have a lot of space and potentially buy new machines in order to achieve this. So first of all, is that correct? And then second of all, how does that impact the price that like Evermore has to pay for these ingredients?
Oh, it's expensive. We definitely pay a pretty penny for that, working at that quality. And for the chicken too, if you're looking at the controlled atmosphere stunning systems, they're relatively new and they're way more cost, they cost a lot more than traditional systems. There are more and more processors in the US shifting over to these systems, which is great. Another thing I'd like to point out, just in terms of the cost of these ingredients, is the farm lobby in the US funnels a lot of money to conventional farmers. So it's not just, oh, do these processes make food more expensive? It's also, why is the cheaper food so cheap?
Yeah, yeah. That's the question for humans too, I would say. Um, Another thing that this kind of, to me, if I'm just kind of looking at this web of interconnectedness in my mind, it seems to me like animal welfare and regenerative food go hand in hand, that you can't have one without the other. Would you say that's correct?
Oh, absolutely, because again, the regenerative processes, especially with ruminants, they're really mimicking nature, and that's how we give an animal a good quality of life. We let it live a natural life. So 100% they go hand in hand.
So, do you know of any large organizations? I'm not going to say their names, but major food sourcing companies, food manufacturers. Do you know of any of those that are using regenerative food and even sustainable practices?
Sure, so I'm gonna go back to sort of the suppliers, the people who are actually growing raising the animals. And I can think of this mostly in chicken. There are some huge suppliers, like we're talking massive scale suppliers who've bought up some smaller brands that they're maintaining their own brand identity. And that sort of creates like a halo effect for the entire large big ag corporation. But it also, there's a recognition that that demand is there. A lot of this change is going to happen from the bottom up, right? We as consumers have to create that demand. It's not just going to benevolently happen from the top down.
Mhm. Tell
One
me
up.
more about this. Sorry, I just want to ask you. Tell me more about this chicken award. I feel like that
Okay.
ties into this.
Yeah, so we just won this award. I am super psyched about it. It was from Compassion in World Farming, and it's the Good Chicken Award. The award ceremony was in Paris, which that was super fun.
Ooh la
And
la.
yeah, it was a global thing. So there are companies meeting these like really cool welfare initiatives from around the world. So that was awesome, getting to connect with other like-minded individuals. But the reason we won is because we were the first commercially prepared food for pets or humans to meet something called the Better Chicken Commitment. And we were actually the second company overall. And that first company was actually a dog treat company. So animal space represent. And the Better Chicken Commitment, we're a smaller company that took it, but some massive, like multinational corporations have taken this commitment. And the commitment was designed by 11 very, very highly regarded animal welfare organizations, like Compassion in World Farming, who I just mentioned, the ASPCA, Mercy for Animals, just a lot of organizations that focus on animal welfare. And this commitment had a bunch of tenets, like things you had to meet. And one of them was stocking density, how much room the chickens have. One was environmental enrichment, how can they express their natural behaviors in this environment. One was slaughtering technique, which we just talked about. And the one that we just met, which brought us to this award, and I think is probably the most important, is actually breed, using a higher welfare breed of chicken. Believe it or not, most of the chickens that we eat, not just in the US, but around the world, are a breed called the Cornish cross, and they are basically designed to grow as quickly as possible and with like gigantic breasts, because a lot of the taste for chicken, especially in the US, is for the breast meat. And what happens is these chickens live miserable lives because of this growth. They can get heart attacks, their legs can break, and they're just intrinsically low welfare just for existing. Now, the higher welfare breeds, the heritage breeds, they're more kind of how a chicken should be, right? They're more naturally proportioned birds. So the supply of those is really low. And initiatives such as the Better Chicken Commitment, particularly this initiative, has helped increase the supply of these birds because all of these companies have committed to be buying them. And that's made it possible for us to do something that we've wanted to do for a really long time, which is buy these birds. And the last component of the commitment is having an outside agency auditing you. So making sure that not only do you meet the commitment or hit whatever benchmark you are on that journey, but also that you stick with it.
Wow. I mean, what you're saying means that like the chicken breast that we get in the stores is going to start looking different if all goes well. But I haven't, I mean, I don't buy a lot of chicken breast in the store, but I haven't seen this being talked about on social media or on marketing. Why is that?
Well, it's just something that people don't know a lot about it. I mean, I'm very excited for the animal welfare organizations for creating this, but I do think that there's a real marketing problem. I do think that the average consumer is not aware of these initiatives. And it's going to take a while for the chicken breasts that we see at the supermarket to look different. And I don't know, have you seen pasture chicken breasts? They are a little different looking, just
I
in
don't
terms of
know.
I mean, they still look like chicken breasts, but they are a little smaller. I personally think that they have like a different appearance and like the muscle striation, they definitely taste a little different. So I do think it will be an adjustment to consumers, but I also think we're a long way off from them kind of being the predominant things that we're buying on our shelves, because you think chicken is expensive, like just being grown on this like massive industrial scale. And we're still talking about heritage birds grown on an industrial scale, but they grow slower. They're just intrinsically more expensive to raise. The reality is we all just have to get used to paying a bit more for our meat and eating less of it. Our dogs don't have that luxury. They just need to keep eating the meat.
Yeah, and that is definitely something I think because I have 3 cats, and they don't have as much range of food options as dogs do. So I do worry about that. And I do think about that a lot, and especially the environmental underpinnings of it all. But that leads me to a question. So I live in a place where there's lots of small holding farmers, and there's a person here who sources um, like leftover cuts from the farmers and then repackages them to be the proper grams and like configuration of different meat sources, and then freezes them for dogs. And people go and they say, Fido is X number of pounds. Can you please create 4 meals a week with your meats for Fido? The person who told me about this is a dog trainer, so he's pretty educated about a dog's nutritional needs, and he says that he does supplement the meat with other ingredients. However, I doubt he knows as much about a dog's nutritional needs as, say, you or Allison does. So can you tell me, like, I'm not asking for a sales pitch, but can you tell me why it makes more sense for someone to like use a food like Evermore instead of trying to parcel out their own different meals for Fido?
I mean, honestly, if you have the time, the energy, the ability to learn, I think that, home preparation is great. I will say just buying a butcher blend from a farm, you're probably missing a lot. And I would highly recommend adding something to that, and also just being very conscious about or asking, okay, how much liver is in here? Because liver is something you can really, really overdo. It can really cause problems, especially with copper. And just being aware of what is in that blend and how much, I think, would be really important, because I have seen a lot of farm-based butcher blends that aren't fully balanced. So it's important to know what you're getting and know what you need to add to it. Our food actually has quite a bit of produce, And there is, as with humans, there are a lot of different dietary movements and beliefs. And one thing that's really popular are raw diets, like the 80-10-10, which are raw diets with like no carbohydrates. And dogs have no natural requirement for carbohydrates. Like they technically can live without fruits, without vegetables, without any grains. But what we're finding through more and more research is that their biomes really suffer from that. And that fiber, from plant materials are really good for them, that their body can utilize like the antioxidants in fruits and vegetables the same way that ours can. Like, obviously there are differences there, but plant matter added to the meat can really be extremely beneficial for dogs. Again, there's no one size fits all for any animal. Like, you really have to look, okay, what does this bring to the table? What is my dog, through their digestive system, through their energy levels, through their skin and coat, what is my dog telling me that what they need? And one thing I will say where our food really shines is for older dogs, for dogs that are health compromised, right? Like, oftentimes what you find is younger, healthier dogs do really well on a raw diet. Our gently cooked food that has more vegetables in it, that is exposed to a heat process, that is so much easier on the system and can really help a dog that's going through something.
Yeah, that actually leads me to a question I really want to ask you. Tell me about gently cooked. What does that mean?
Sure. It's funny because that's actually like now an entire category name, right? Like, that's, people call it gently cooked food for this entire category, with other companies who I'm not going to name, but some of them are very big and well funded. But we were probably the first company to use that term in our marketing, and I regret so hard not trademarking it. But so gently cooking is using a lower temperature cook process, right? We know at higher temperatures, there are all kinds of chemical reactions that can create harmful substances. And I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of that, one, because I doubt my ability to explain it very well, and two, because it's kind of boring. But once you process something at a high enough heat, it creates more harm than good. So what I would consider gently cooked, if I were to name a number, would probably not going above 180 degrees, which a lot of actually like human raw foodies will say that, oh, if it doesn't surpass this temperature, it's fine. But that would be kind of my threshold for what would be gently cooked. Now, we use a process called sous vide, where our food is cooked at low temperatures inside a vacuum sealed pouch. So there's no oxygen in that process, and that maintains like nutrients and flavor, and oxidation doesn't happen. So we just end up with a more nutritious and flavorful end product. But prior to that, we were doing what most companies do, which is kettle cooking. So, we were just cooking in this like giant commercial size kettle. But when we had the opportunity to move over to this new process, we did. Now, the one I do have one qualm with this process, and that there is plastic involved. And the plastic that we use is totally food grade. It's free from phthalates, BPA, like endocrine disruptors. We've like done independent testing, but I don't love the idea that we're putting plastic into the world. So that's to me like being totally transparent about the pros and cons
Wow.
here.
Wow. You've mentioned so many times testing. You've mentioned testing the material you're using to make the food, testing the actual food itself, testing the source ingredients, testing the final product. How do you have time to make all this food and do all this testing?
Well, luckily we don't do the testing, independent laboratories do.
Yeah.
But there's so many reasons why we're super diligent about it. I mean, first of all, you have pathogens, right? Many of the people that are coming to our food are doing so because they've had bad experiences or are afraid of, getting salmonella, E. coli, listeria, any number of things that can be associated with a raw food, right? Cooking is a kill step. And that said, every process is fallible, right? So before we send anything to the general public, we test it to make sure that it is free from the pathogens I just mentioned, but also yeast and mold. And we test something called aerobic plate count, which I always have a hard time explaining, but basically it sort of is about the potential for bacterial problems. And it's an indicator, and I just don't want to get too deeply into that. But we also do nutritional analysis, and this is something I don't know any other company that does this as regularly as we do. And one of the reasons we do the nutritional analysis, first of all, is because we are using these sort of natural ingredients where there's fluctuations, depending on what time of year it is, depending on what's going on with the soil. There are so many reasons that the nutrients can change. So we want to monitor that. And it's also, you can get some really interesting data there. We're total data nerds. So that's our testing protocol. And we do this, like I said, every time we produce food. We do this for all of our flavors.
Wow. I'm just really blown away by like your commitment to the quality of your food. What do you think? I mean, to me, when you talk to me about this, I'm like, this is amazing stuff. And I can't imagine where you could go from here. But what are Evermore's like next goals? You mentioned at the very beginning that there's always more to do. You can always like do better. What have you set your sights on for next?
The next thing I would love, and I know Allison, who is really the one in charge of sourcing our ingredients. I actually call her the sorceress.
I like it. Very
Yeah.
clever.
The one thing I think where we really want to improve on our sourcing, but are having a very hard time just because the supply isn't there, is our turkey. We have pretty much the highest welfare turkey that is generally available, and even that is hard enough to find. But we would love to go for a more heritage breed turkey. And just to give you comparison here about how difficult that is, every year in the US, we slaughter 9 billion chickens. Like 9 billion. And turkey, the number is closer to 220 million. And of that, like between a third and like probably around a third, if not a little more, are strictly for Thanksgiving.
Oh,
So there's a bit of a challenge there. Again, like I'd say we're using probably better turkey than anyone else, in our category, but yeah, we'd love to be able to do better there. So I'd say that that's our number one sourcing goal.
say like there's this horrible situation where a pet parent is not able to get their hands on Evermore and they have to look for a different kind of food. What are some things they should look out for? Could you say like green flags or red flags in what they see written on the food package or on the company's website?
Sure. And I would urge people to look for foods that are ethically sourced and quote humane. Unfortunately, both of those words can be pretty empty. And I don't think that, we have some welfare certifications, and I don't necessarily think that they're everything. And I could go down another rabbit hole about that. But I think that they can be really useful for a consumer. And the two that I would suggest are looking for Global Animal Partnership or Certified Humane. With Global Animal Partnership, they kind of have a stepped system where there's different like numbers associated to different levels of higher and higher welfare. And with Global Animal Partnership, I would really want to see poultry at a 2 or above, which you're probably not going to find, but that's where I'd really want to see that.
Out
And
of how many?
well, they're actually changing the system, and this is going to start being very confusing for people. But right now it's out of 5. For all of them, they're doing something different that I don't even want to get into. But right now, I would look for poultry for 2 or above, and then for ruminants 4 or above. And this is just a system like categorizing. Okay, these are the interventions that the animals have, or this is how much room they have. It's called Global Animal Partnership, and you can go on their website and learn more about that. Then there's Certified Humane, and that's another one that you'll see a lot of. And the ASPCA actually has a really great resource called the Grocery List. So you can go on the ASPCA's website and look for pet food on their grocery list, and they'll kind of have foods with approved welfare certifications there. What I would say are red flags are using certain claims that don't mean anything in an attempt to sound better. My favorites are cage-free chicken. Now, in the US, all chicken, and actually most of the world, there's only, and I think in China, in certain places, there are some exceptions, but all chicken raised for meat is cage-free. So if you're saying cage-free chicken, you're saying chicken. If on poultry, you're seeing no hormone, like no added hormones, well, in the US, it's illegal to add hormones. I think in Europe too, for poultry, you can't use hormones in poultry production. So anything that's like basically a truism that's being made to sound like a positive claim, that's a red flag. Trying to think of some more red flags. Oh, for the cows, my favorite is ranch raised or family farmed. Those are also two things that mean absolutely nothing. Even the words humane on a package, there's actually no definition for humane. All a company has to do is write their own criteria of what they think makes it humane, and then they can use humane on their labels. So I would say, again, I think that the conversation about certifications is complicated, but just in terms of you're in a pinch, you need to find some food, like that's a very quick shorthand way to know that at least there's like a minimum threshold. And another thing, if you're looking at working with smaller companies that maybe don't have the resource to go this way, you still want to be able to get in touch with someone at the company's customer service level and get a clear answer about how animals are raised, and not just like, oh, it's humane. Ask some more specific questions, like how are these chickens slaughtered, like what is the stocking density, just like go in there with some specific questions. And if they can't get back to you with an answer, that just means that they're not being transparent.
This actually, I thought about this earlier. You are here because Evermore sponsors the Veterinary Cannabis Society. You are one of, if not our longest running sponsor. And at this time of filming in November 2024, you are our highest level sponsor. And we couldn't thank you enough for that. We can't thank you enough. And as everyone can hear, you're also super fun people to work with. But when it comes to cannabis, one of the things that the Veterinary Cannabis Society always asserts is that you should be able to get with ease the COA, certificates of analysis, for any product that you purchase from this, veterinary cannabis supplier. Are you publishing COAs for Evermore pet food?
Well, we have a lot of different ingredients, and no, we're not publishing the COAs of every different ingredient. Now, with pet food, the thing that usually pet food manufacturers keep secret that people really should know about are the nutritionals, like the actual full nutritionals, and that we have published and easily accessible. A lot of companies actually like hide this data, which is so weird. Back to COAs though, we do get COAs for every single ingredient that's not fresh, and we keep those on file. And we have had situations where customers have been concerned about something specific, and while we are completely open about which ranches we buy our food from, some of these are like very specialty ingredients. So what we do in those cases, if a customer has very specific questions, we'll like black out certain relevant things to keep it kind of proprietary information, but then share whatever they need us to share.
Yeah, I never thought about that actually. That is difficult now that I think about it. I'm thinking of what are those? There's this one bar that it says right on the front package, 9 cashews, 3 dates, etc., etc. That is actually kind of proprietary information, isn't it? So you're kind of in this awkward place where you want to be able to share the exact ingredients and as much information as you can for these pet parents who often have very sick pets. But on the other side of things, you've got to protect the product that you've worked so hard to develop. Does that
Yeah.
is
Yeah,
that hard?
and you know, we are, I think, more open than most companies. Like we share like what percentage of meat goes in, like what percentage of, you know, different things go in, and we share where we get our proteins. So I would say we are very, very open, but then once you get down to the nitty-gritty of like, okay, like, do we need to share the COA on our oats? Like, I don't know that it's really necessary to get that granular with our customers.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. So what do you think is next for the pet food industry? Do you think the industry as a whole is going to move more and more toward regenerative ingredients, or where do you see it going?
I do think that the industry is gonna move more towards like humane and regenerative, but I do think it's gonna be like a smaller, it's always gonna be like a niche part of the industry. Now, what I really see happening are some trends that like I'm not too thrilled with, and that's more vegan pet foods
Oh,
and insect pet foods. And the third one I'm actually hasn't really hit yet, but I am interested in and I'm cautiously optimistic with, but like I want to learn more and let it, you know, percolate for a little longer, and that's cultivated meat. So, and obviously these are all steps to reduce suffering, and they're all steps to, you know, reduce environmental impact. But I think that there's like a couple of like major quality and ethics problems here. The first, right, it's like we have carnivores. There is no arguing that our pets are carnivores. Now, dogs are not obligate carnivores. There's, you know, they are omnivorous, like leaning carnivore, but still like fundamentally they're carnivores. And cats are 100% obligate carnivores, right? That is what they evolved to eat. And while it is true, we can balance all of the nutrients that they need into like a vegan diet option. Like that would basically be like you and me, like drinking Ensure for our entire lives. Or what's that
I
product?
hate and sure.
Or Soylent, or like
Yeah.
any of those. And I think it's not fair because the animal given the choice would choose the meat. And you know, sometimes in very rare medical situations where an animal is allergic to everything, it's necessary. But I think that there's really the ethics of taking away that choice from them. I just like don't think that that's fundamentally fair. And I think more importantly, from like a nutritional standpoint, once again, they can stay alive on because you know all the nutritional building blocks are added, but that's all in supplemental form, and these foods are highly processed, right? So just like nutritionally, again, it's not optimal for them. And the third, I'm pretty cynical about the third component of this is a lot of bigger companies are getting into this game, and these vegan ingredients, these vegetable-based ingredients, these soy-based ingredients, there's a huge profit margin there. Like this is big business. So we're being sold this as being more environmentally friendly. And in many ways it is, you know, in a lot of ways it is. But at the same time, this stuff is being sold to us as expensively, if not more so, than animal-based options. And these companies are just making like huge profit margins.
That makes
And
sense.
yeah, and insects too, like all of the insect foods I've seen are like extremely processed. They're highly processed. And again, these are like high temperature processes that create all these like compounds that are not good for human or animal health. And we don't know enough about the long-term effects of what like subsisting on insect protein does for pets, you know, or even, you know, vegan. Like yes, there are some vegan companies that have been around for a while, but not here for it. Especially one company just released a vegan cat food, which
What's
I
it made
find
out of?
so wrong on every
Yeah.
level. I
Oh,
find that so wrong. Even, you know, if it can technically keep them alive, our cats are carnivores. they should not be eating vegan.
Yeah.
Now, the third thing, biomeats, scientists are working on creating bioidentical cloned meat, or there's some fermentation processes. And that I think is interesting. That I think if there can be a process where it is a biologically identical tissue, then I think I'd be more open as a business owner to looking at going in that direction. But I wouldn't want to be experimenting on our pets. I don't think that that's, and a lot of the companies are starting off with this as pet food. And I'm sorry, like, I don't want my cat to be a guinea pig. It's my partner, not my business partner, my life partner, because I was talking with him, like, what would it take for you to eat bio meat? And he said, when we can develop a fully functioning kidney that would work as a transplant, then he would consider bio meat. But until we create something that's truly biologically functional, that's sort of his threshold. And I think that that's a really good point.
Yeah, no, that is actually such a good point. That's an amazing, yeah, animals are eating meat because they offer a functional service within the animal that the meat is from. And unless it can offer the same functional service, not the same meat.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a very thoughtful and simple way to explain it.
Yeah, I thought that was really astute of him. So
Yeah.
again, like,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, like, so yeah, in choosing, we're aware of the environmental impacts of meat, which is why we choose to source the way that we do. And again, we as human beings can choose to eat less of it, but I don't think we should impose that choice.
Well, Hanna, this has been an incredible conversation. I learned way more than I expected to learn, to be completely honest with you. And I could honestly sit here and talk to you about this for such a long time. But I thought I knew how busy you were, and now I might have an idea of how truly busy you are. So I will let you go. I'm going to go ahead and put the links to Evermore Pet Food in the description below, as well as the Veterinary Cannabis Society. Do you have any last things you'd like to say before we go?
Oh, I wish I'd prepared something really profound to say, but alas, I don't have anything super profound. Just thank you so much for having me here. I could also continue this conversation for a really long time. And I think just the most important thing is to just be mindful of what you're feeding yourself and what you're feeding your animals. And it's also, the other thing I want to say is it's really, really easy to go down rabbit holes, and we can't be perfect all of the time. So I think it's about baby steps, right? And it's not necessarily, you have to be 100% perfect doing everything right today. Maybe you can eat a little bit less meat tomorrow, and your dog can have like a little bit of regenerative food. It doesn't need to be ours, but like maybe you could buy some really high welfare meat to add to the food that your dog is already eating. So it's just about those baby steps. I think it's really important.
No, it's so true. And also, I think listening to this podcast, at least for me, I feel like I'm so much more equipped to go make choices for my cats. And at least I know the questions I need to ask. And that is in itself a baby step. So thank you for helping myself and all of our listeners take a baby step today.
Thank you for listening to this instance of the Veterinary Cannabis Society podcast. We hope that you learned as much about animal nutrition as we did. In addition to Hanna and Evermore, we'd like to thank the following sponsors for making this podcast possible. They are Antelope Pet Food, Standard Process Veterinary Formulas, Linea SEC, Hemp Heroes for Pets, AstraZana Animal Health, Gaia Provides, Earth Buddy, Vet CS, Rooted Owl, and Furry Faces CBD. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider donating to the Veterinary Cannabis Society by using the link in the description below. You can visit our website if you'd like to learn more, and of course, to contact us if you're interested in becoming a sponsor or being featured on the podcast. Thanks. Have a great day.